Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. With a little less than 8 weeks remaining before the election, President Clinton is way ahead in the polls. Many experts say he has it locked up. Does he? Joining us to consider that question are Everett Ladd, Director of the Institute for Social Inquiry at the University of Connecticut and Director of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research; Frank Newport, Editor-in-Chief of the Gallop poll and co-author of The Evangelical Voter, Religion and Politics in the United States; Allan Lichtman, Professor of History at American University and author of The 13 Keys to the Presidency; and Stephen Hess, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the forthcoming book, America's Political Dynasties, From Adams to Kennedy. The question before this House, a contrarian one: can Dole win? This week on Think Tank. Elections are often compared to a horse race. In this year's race, the horse named Bill Clinton is many furlongs ahead. But people who play the ponies also look at the condition of the track. Working with the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research, we have looked at the election course, and interestingly, much of it seems to favor Dole. First, by about 2-to-1, voters identify themselves as conservative rather than liberal. As always, the majority is in the moderate middle. Moreover, if history is a guide, the Republicans have a built-in advantage. In 6 of the last 7 elections, the GOP presidential candidate has won these 24 states, which would provide 238 of the 270 votes necessary to win the Electoral College. Of course, California holds 54 of these electoral votes, and that is a state where President Clinton won big in 1992 and where he enjoys a wide lead today. Unlike the Republicans, in 6 of the last 7 elections, Democrats have only won one state, Minnesota, and the District of Columbia. What about the issues? Much of the Republican agenda seems overwhelmingly popular. From Gallop poll data, we see 83% of the voters want a balanced budget, 79% want the death penalty, 74% want term limits, 71% want to shrink government, 71% want to cut off welfare after 2 years, 59% want school choice, public or private. Other issues, of course, cut the Democrats' way, though the margin is slimmer. 57% want to ban assault rifles, 54% are against reducing federal spending on social programs, 56% are against a law that would make abortions illegal in all cases except the life of the mother. Well, then why is Bill Clinton ahead? The economy is strong, and that is always a good indicator. But look at these numbers. More voters today are concerned with social issues than economic ones, by 53% to 42%, and Republicans have always done well with the social issues. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us in listening through that extremely objective presentation of the data. Let me go around the room, if I might, with one fast question just to get the ball rolling, a monosyllabic one. Can Dole win? Everett Ladd.
Oh, certainly. It's not clear that he will, but it's certainly possible that he will win. The idea that he's out of it now is a misreading of the data, so far as I can tell.
Frank Newport, Gallop poll.
Sure, I would agree with Everett. Yes, he can certainly win. Anything can happen in an election, but if you look at history, look at elections since World War II, and some other factors we'll talk about in a few minutes probably that weren't in your intro, I would say the odds would heavily favor a Clinton re-election.
Okay, so you really have a different emphasis than Everett on this thing. I mean, we all accept that, sure, anything can happen.
Sure.
All right, Allan Lichtman, American University.
Dole can't win without the God coming down from the machine and saving him. Not because of the polls or the pundits, but because presidential elections are referenda on the performance of the party in power, and incumbent presidents don't lose when the economy is good, foreign policy is going smoothly, their party is united, and things are tranquil at home.
Okay, we will return to that notion. Stephen Hess.
Well, I My hunch would be that Dole, if he does well, could narrow the gap sufficiently to hold a Republican Congress. But can he himself win? I would say no, given the state of the economy at this time.
Okay, well, let's get into this now. We presented in the setup piece 4 views of this electorate, all of which could be read as fairly conservative. Doesn't that say that this thing sort of automatically has kind of got to close? You know, you have polls that show 37, 38, 39% of the people identifying as conservatives. Are those people going to vote for Clinton?
If you looked at all of the data that are out there, Frank may disagree with this, but in my view is if you look at all the data that are out there and just cut out the trial heats, you would not advance the case that it's a likely Clinton victory. The composite of the data, other than the trial heats, point otherwise. Now, if you believe the trial heats, which are averaging 15 points or something of that kind, of course the election's over. Since I don't think those numbers mean much of anything, I'm less inclined to
You were
stress
taking
them.
the view of, except for that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like to play? I mean,
Well, if you have an actual vote, of course, and you say, if it were not for the fact that people voted this way, but people haven't voted.
Right.
What Everett said, I think it has a lot of truth to it, and I also think Bill Clinton, his pollsters, and belated Dick Morris knew that as well, and that's why starting with the State of the Union address, a lot of Clinton's efforts through the last 6 months have been to, or last 9 months really, has been to move himself more towards the middle to preempt a lot of those issues that his polling was showing as well that he was out of sync with. He's, has signed or will sign soon the gay rights bill that says that the states can disallow gay marriages and things along those lines, which is, I think, a good example of that.
I would add to that if your data shows that the American people are moderately conservative, then where has Bill Clinton been, or where has he been coached by Dick Morris for the last 2 years? He's probably moderately conservative enough for where the American people are at this time. You might also say, on your social versus economic, that when the economy is this good, when you've got the second quarter at 4.8% growth, when you have unemployment at 5.1%, when you have inflation less than 3%, people maybe are not responding to pollsters and saying, the economy is the main issue.
Thank you, Mr. President. That was very well said. Right. We have no spinners here. This is an announcement, right?
Forget Dick
And
Morris,
Steve-
forget the consultants, forget the admin. They don't turn elections. If Bill Clinton was facing what Jimmy Carter faced, a terrible recession, a disaster abroad with Iran hostage, he could have 100 Dick Morrises advising him. It wouldn't matter.
Alan, you have how many keys? 13 keys?
13 keys.
And you say that if the incumbent doesn't have 7...
The incumbent needs 8.
The incumbent needs 8. And how many does... and Clinton has 8.
He has 8. That's why
Has
something
8.
external has to happen.
Well, now give me the 8.
The 8 that
quickly,
he has.
because I looked through them, and some of them are not, by my lights, measurable. Tell me
well,
what the 8 are.
the 8 are, he's the sitting president.
That's for sure.
He was elected without a party fight.
That's true.
The economy over the 3.5 years has grown
Fair enough.
faster than previous.
Right.
There's not a recession in the election
Okay.
year. There's no social unrest.
Wrong, in my judgment.
Well,
I mean,
sustained social unrest like we had in the 60s.
you have a vast plurality or majority of the people saying there's a moral crisis in this country.
They've been saying that forever.
And
You
that's
can
why
poll
Republicans have won the
anytime.
presidency.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Actually, not
You
forever. by the
can
way.
always have that.
What do you say? You say
Well,
no.
it's not forever. No, that's not true.
At least since the 60s,
for,
they've been
for,
saying
for,
that.
For 25 years,
Okay.
there's been a sense of a growing problem in that area, but it certainly wasn't the New Deal agenda.
But when I say social unrest, I mean what was going on in the 1960s. Upheavals of a violent nature in the streets that threatened to overcome the social fabric.
Listen, Alan,
and that we don't have.
Hubert Humphrey lost by half a point in that circumstance, and you're telling me that's a rule that if but you lose with all the social turmoil by only 0.5%, you're going to make that into a rigid law?
That's one of 13 factors.
Okay,
You asked me
give
what
me the other
factors
8.
he had.
Give me
There are
the other 8.
I think we're almost done. He's dodged the scandal. It hasn't hit him personally with any proof of wrongdoing, and he faces a challenging candidate who is neither a national hero like Eisenhower or a great communicator like Reagan.
No, we can talk about whether the scandal has touched.
I have another
Fair
sort
enough,
of
but
another
yes.
sort of poll for our scientific folks. Go out to the go out to the shopping mall. A very good one for at least 3 of us who live in the Washington area would be Montgomery Mall, Montgomery County, because it has Heck Company is the anchor at one side, a sort of downscale department store. Nordstrom's is the anchor at the other, an upscale. And take a look at who's there, and it's jammed, and people are buying. And in those circumstances, unless there are other interceding issues, Americans getting killed abroad or so forth, I would say that that's a pretty good poll.
Everett,
50% of the American population hasn't made up their mind how to vote, how they're going to vote on November 5.
pretty.
Yeah, and so, I mean, there's no question that the economy is doing well, and there's no question that it's a good thing to be an incumbent when the economy is doing well.
Yeah.
It's not just the economy, though. It's a whole range
it's
of
a more
factors.
complex. No, the country's not happy about itself in terms of its performance in many dimensions. It is happy about the economic performance. It should be. The economy is a roaring success. Despite all kinds of efforts to play to the contrary, the American economy has been an incredible success story throughout modern times. I've never been as economic determinist as my colleagues are here.
Nor have I.
No.
Well, nor am I.
There
I'm
are a
saying
lot
it's
of
range of
elections.
factors.
There are a lot of elections that, you know, people
Yeah.
say it was the economy stupid,
Yeah.
but you can equally put a lot of other issues in there, be it the charisma
Vietnam
of an
War,
Eisenhower, or the economy was doing well and Humphrey lost. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on.
I'd have another point that would be helpful or hopeful to the Dole people, and I think that more people probably make up their mind now in what we call the campaign period than they used to when we had stronger parties. People voted because they were Democrats and Republicans, particularly now with the with the TV debates. I mean, the last time, it was the first time that TV debates actually grew in Nielsen in popularity. More people watched the last TV debate than the first one in 1992. So I think that gives hope to the Republicans.
To Bob Dole in a debate? Come on.
This is a very
Bob Dole as I
important
do.
point. The landscape has changed in a very, very substantial way, and I don't think we've caught up in part with how much it's changed. We asked, for example, in a national survey, are you a Republican, Democrat, Independent, the standard question. And then later on, about 20 questions further into the survey, we said, well, do you really feel closer to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or doesn't it matter? And 30% of those who called themselves Republicans the first time said they actually didn't feel closer to either party. And 35% of those who called themselves Democrats, asked the standard question, said they really didn't feel closer to either party. I mean, you've got an enormously unanchored electorate. Now, the fact that it's unanchored doesn't mean that it's going to move. I mean, an unanchored boat sitting in the water might stay in the same position for an extended period of time. But the idea that this electorate is locked in is wrong.
Let me toss out a few other ones, just again in the contrarian mode. First of all, as the Republicans like to point out, Dole is only now preparing to spend money for the first time in about a year, whereas the Clinton people have been spending and spending and spending. It's a long story. But he's got $60 million of federal money and probably another 60 in soft money. That's a lot of money that he hasn't been able to spend. Secondly, the allegedly all-important re-elect numbers, which it is said that if a candidate does not have 50% of the people answering the question, would you want to re-elect the president, or would you, his numbers are about 51, 52, very, very close to that situation. Thirdly, the argument is that really all these polls have been shifted forward because of the Olympics, the late convention, early Labor Day. We're really looking at the functional equivalent of late August polls rather than a settling down. Anybody, anything?
Yeah, my hunch on that is that while Clinton looks very good in the polls and may continue to look very good in the polls, there's not much of a safety net there. Because then when you get into the question of your trust and so forth and so on. So this is fine if everything is going well. If something happens between now and election where things go against him, then I think you could have a swift fall.
That's the
I don't
key.
see anything happening.
Something has to go, but there's nothing Bob Dole could do, because anything he says is going to be discounted as political.
Let me ask you a question. That you had brought up the issue of scandal before. A month ago, I guess you could have said, well, it's just all fizzled out. you can see now it's not all fizzled out. I mean, there may be no smoking gun. You got Richard Morris, you got Susan McDougal, you got Kenneth Starr, you got a lot of things already in the deck. I mean, that surely can play a role, can't it?
It could, absolutely. But you need something that hits the president himself. Clinton is like this guy walking through a battlefield, and all these bombs are exploding and obliterating people around him, and he keeps moving forward. One of the bombs is going to have to land on him.
I don't think that's
and
an
I think
analogy
that's very
I would
unlikely.
pursue if I were in your chair. I mean, because, sure, some people get through those kind of battlefields. George Washington did, I gather.
Many
on
did.
occasions.
That's a good point. We keep using the term tip-over point. I mean, there may be a point where enough things accrue to Clinton's side of the negative side of his ledger that the public, in some sense, tips over. Says, all right, that's enough, and you see the numbers actually move. I would also point out, however, Ben, that we've ignored Perot in the discussions, and he's down at, very single digits in the polls, but he was also in single digits at the poll at about this time when he jumped back into the race in 1992, and he ended up getting 19% of the vote, and that was on the virtue of his buying half-hour blocks of time and doing well in the debates. So I wouldn't discount the fact that
But
Perot
he probably will not be in the debates,
That's right.
near as I can
well,
read now.
but
Let's
that
just
would
look
be a
at
big-
some more data to flesh some of this out. For the last 40 years, polls have asked, which party will you vote for in the congressional race? Compared to final results, the surveys have always shortchanged the Republicans. Second, candidates have made up a lot of ground after Labor Day, even as many as 13 points for Harry Truman in 1948. Frank Newport, I know that's something you wanted to deal with, that second one
Yeah,
particularly.
good point. Let's speak to the second. There have been 12 races, and the four that we've talked about here are the four where there have been significant movements. The 13 point was 1948. There were three other races where candidates moved in terms of the gap by between 9 and 11. One of those when Reagan, who was tied with Jimmy Carter in 1980, actually moved ahead and won by 10 points. Ford and Dole, as his Veep, caught up with Jimmy Carter almost to have been about 2 points was the other example, and Humphrey caught up with Nixon almost in 1968. But remember, there are 8 other races which there was absolutely no significant movement in the gap, and so what you saw is what you got.
Can close or may not close.
Well,
I mean,
again, I would look at, as a scholar, you look at the data and say the predicted, everything else being equal, the predicted change in the gap is 6 points. The maximum based on 12 data points would be 13 points.
And Clinton's 21 ahead, right?
Yeah, so
well,
if he stays...
Excuse me, I mean, there were polls in the last week that show him anywhere between 21 and 11. So, and Time Magazine report, I haven't had a chance to check it out, but said that the closure from mid-September to Election Day in 1976 there was 15 points worth of closure. So
not based on our Gallop polling, but
no, but
so,
there are a lot of polls, as in
Sure.
all of these data.
So-
all of these data, we should be
Yeah.
informing our viewer. There are a lot of numbers floating around.
However, I wouldn't say, again, as a hopefully a scientific approach to it, there may be a lot of numbers, but let's look at them very precisely. So I'd say the most precise look we can look at for the last 12 elections since World War II suggests that 6 points is the average, 13 is the outside maximum, and if Clinton is considerably outside of that in September, that doesn't mean Dole can't win, but it would mean statistically the probability of winning would be unprecedented.
Except 13 is within the window, or almost within the window, of some of these polls. Again, it's a pretty inexact science. I mean,
well, I don't know if Everett and I, being polling is our life, would agree it's an inexact science, but we try to make it as exact as we can.
You wouldn't agree to it. You would certify to it, I assume.
If Clinton wins by 10 points or more, I think the Democrats have a very good chance of taking back both houses of Congress. If he wins marginally, I think not. But perhaps the more interesting question in this election is, what happens if Dole wins? Then you've got a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, the Republicans having virtually every big state governorship, a conservative Supreme Court. That would be a degree of Republican power that Republicans haven't had, not since Eisenhower, but since the 1920s, since the era of Harding and Coolidge.
If Dole wins, this would be
a revolution.
Well, I don't know.
Even
we've all learned not to use the word revolution.
Even if Clinton wins, but the Republicans retain control of the House by a small number. And I think that's really what we're talking about, very small numbers. Now, what happens in the off-year election? Well, we know what happens in the off-year election. The in-party loses. So, and what happens 2 years after the
in-party of the president?
Of the president,
Right.
so that the Republicans start gaining seats in '98. Then you get to the year 2000. Now, the Democrats in office are a pretty old party by that time, so the odds are against them. So that if the Republicans can retain control of the House this time, it does offer the possibilities of the Republican decade. which I think is quite interesting since all of the talk has been about
the first
Clinton.
decade of the next century would be a Republican decade.
Well, it could well be.
With President
Talk about
Kemp.
fearless predictions.
Yeah,
my
God,
goodness.
Steve, that is, listen, I want to tell you what it's going to look like in 2020 because I know that with certainty, and nobody. Hey, Everett, you were looking at the opposite. You started to
You know
answer
the history
Frank.
of predictions, though. You predict
No,
something that is so outrageous, you see, that if it happens, you remind everybody.
That's
If it
right.
doesn't happen, no one notices.
We'll
Anyway.
come back in the year 2000.
Thank you,
All right, Everett, you were beginning to challenge Frank on this
Well,
notion
I mean-
of looking at history as
I
a
mean,
guide.
there's no question that Clinton's ahead. Everyone grants that. I'm not sure that I'm as impressed as Frank is about the historical experience and what that tells you. I mean, we've had so few presidential elections, and the whole structure of presidential electioneering has been changing so much. The electorate is vastly less anchored than it was in the past. So I'm not at all impressed about the historical comparison. 50%, so far as I can tell, of this electorate is up for grabs today. Now, the fact that it's up for grabs doesn't mean that Dole will grab it. But I mean, if 50% is up for grabs, that's an enormous opportunity, and it's a foolish person who says the election's over.
What has gone wrong in the Dole campaign? I mean, there were polls just a month ago, admittedly after his bounce at the Republican convention, where there were polls at 2%, at 5%, at 7%. He was looking good. Kemp was flying. The convention went well, and it really looked like it was going to be a serious horse race.
You've got to get back to fundamentals. The problem with Dole is not that he's running such a bad campaign that he can't win. The problem is he can't win, and that's why he appears to be running a bad campaign. He is battling against historical circumstances, and I do think history is a guide, because if not history, what? Entrail reading? And I think we can go all the way back over 100 years and show.
Yeah, but there is another thing to look at, which is common sense. And if you see a largely conservative country, which I think most people would agree are a moderate conservative country, and a Democratic Party and a Democratic president who can at least be portrayed as liberal, then you're saying that whatever it says, there's something up for grabs out there.
But that's not the way presidential elections work. You're asking the wrong question. It's not liberal versus conservative. No. It is, shall we rehire the incumbent administration?
Yeah, let me phrase the question.
Sure.
Shall we rehire the liberal the liberal president of the Liberal Party?
Dole would love that to be the question.
Of course he would.
And it never has been.
Well, I don't think that's true.
I'm
sorry. I just
the study of history demonstrates that all the way back to 1860.
If you had to pick one indicator as to which way the country is going, I mean, isn't liberal conservative a pretty good idea?
Yeah, I mean, in 1936 or 1940, should we rehire the candidate of the Liberal Party who has presided over the Democratic Revolution? I mean, the answer was yes, and that was a powerful thing in Roosevelt's favor.
But you had liberalism continuing into the 50s. You had two Eisenhower elections that went against the general trend of what the party identifications were, what liberal or conservatives were, because of performance.
I certainly wouldn't disagree with the idea that more is in play in a presidential election than the ideological climate of the country.
Right.
I mean, that's absolutely true. On the other hand, the ideological climate of the country is an important factor in presidential voting. Now, you may have an ideological climate which is favoring the conservative candidate, and he may not capitalize for a variety of reasons. I mean, there are other things in play. But you would rather run in 1996 as the candidate of the Conservative Party than as the candidate of the Liberal Party.
Well, as we said earlier,
the incumbent.
Yeah, 2 points there. One, Clinton knows that. That's why he's been running from the liberal label, doing everything he can. And second is the incumbency is powerful.
All right, let me just close this out. We are running out of time. Let's go around the room the other way now. Back to our original question. Having heard all these wonderful arguments, we ask again, very short answer, can Dole win?
Same answer. I haven't been convinced otherwise by my colleagues here. It would be very hard. I don't think he'll win.
Not unless there's an indictment of Bill or Hillary Clinton, or heaven forbid, a horrible disaster abroad.
You have expanded the list from Bill Clinton to Bill and Hillary Clinton. Thank you for it.
I deal in probabilities. Of course, Dole can win for the reasons that were mentioned. A lot of things can happen, but if you deal in probabilities, the odds are significantly in favor of Clinton being reelected.
Everett Ladd.
The race is going to be decided in a plus or minus 4 range. That is, Clinton's going to win by 4 or lose by 4. That's the range in which we're operating.
Which one?
And the odds are obviously point to Clinton on the plus side. But if it's in that range, and I believe it is, it's up for grabs.
Very, very interesting. I think Dole can win, although he's behind. Thank you, Everett Ladd, Stephen Hess, Frank Newport, and Allan Lichtman. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from you. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.